Imagine having a huge piece of land in the very center of your city that was closed to the public for roughly 120 years. Then, after decades of negotiations, that land is finally returned to the people. In 2023, part of it opens to the public. Families can walk there, and people can experience a piece of their own city that generations before them could never enter. And the long-term plan is to turn this enormous former military base into a major national park. But now, just 3 years later, the government is considering using this land for housing. That's exactly what's happening with Yongsan Park in Seoul, South Korea. And I want to be very precise about something from the beginning, that the government has not finalized a decision to demolish Yongsan Park yet. As of August 2026, the government is reviewing the possibility of using Yongsan Children's Garden and potentially all parts of the Yongsan Park area for public housing. The exact number of homes and final development plan have not been decided. And that's exactly why I believe we need to talk about this now, before an irreversible decision is made. So, what exactly is Yongsan? The former Yongsan military base covers approximately 3 million square meters. And this isn't land somewhere on the outskirts of Seoul, but it's in the heart of the city, between Namsan and the Han River, near the National Museum of Korea and the War Memorial of Korea. The broader Yongsan Park area has been planned at around 3 million square meters. For a highly developed megacity like Seoul, finding another piece of land of this scale in the urban core is practically impossible. And that's what makes Yongsan so special. It's not simply an empty government property waiting to be developed. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to create a huge public landscape in the center of one of Asia's major cities. But the history is perhaps even more important than the size. For roughly 120 years, ordinary Koreans were essentially unable to freely access this land. It was used as a major military installation. Its history is connected to Japanese military occupation, the colonial period, the Korean War era, and the US-South Korea alliance. So for generations, Seoul residents lived around this enormous piece of land without being able to freely enter it. Then, after decades of negotiations and planning, the military land began to be returned to Korea. And in May 2023, approximately 300,000 square meters were opened to the public as Yongsan Children's Garden. For Koreans, this was more than the opening of another park. A place that had been inaccessible for more than a century was finally becoming public space. A former military compound was beginning to be transformed into a public landscape, and the long-term vision was to turn this broader site into Yongsan Park. And this wasn't simply a political slogan. In 2007, Korea enacted the Special Act on the creation of Yongsan Park. The law established a framework for transforming the former military land into a national park and preserving it for public purposes. Those purposes include history, culture, rest, and natural ecology. The material I reviewed also points to Article 4, which establishes the principle of developing the main base site as Yongsan Park and restricting changes to uses other than a park or disposal of the land by sale. So this is one of the most important questions. If the government wants to use this land for housing, what happens to the legal framework that was specifically created to protect its park purpose? Recent discussion has raised the possibility of amending the Special Act or creating an exception to accommodate public housing. In other words, this isn't simply, here's some empty land and let's build apartments. But it potentially means changing the rules that were created specifically for this land. Now, let's be fair. Seoul needs housing. There is a housing affordability problem. The Seoul metropolitan area is extremely expensive, and governments have a legitimate responsibility to increase housing supply. So I'm not against housing. I'm not against development, and I'm certainly not saying that Seoul should stop building homes. The question is Yongsan Park the right place to solve Seoul's housing problem? Several thousand homes have been discussed in connection with the proposal, with higher estimates under more aggressive development scenarios. But these are not final numbers. There is currently no finalized plan or final decision to build, and that's important. because the argument isn't like the government has already destroyed the park because it hasn't yet. So the argument is, should we seriously consider sacrificing an irreplaceable public landscape before we've exhausted other options? And that's where I think the real debate begins. There's a difference between land that can be developed and land that can be replaced. You can build housing through redevelopment. You can reconstruct older neighborhoods, and you can increase density, or you can develop other underused sites. But if you put apartment towers on Yongsan Park, you can't simply recreate another Yongsan Park somewhere else. So where would you put it? And where would you find another 3 million square meters in the center of Seoul? You can't. If Seoul preserves Yongsan, housing can still be built elsewhere. But if Seoul builds housing on Yongsan Park, the opportunity to create this particular public landscape is gone. So I think the question should not be housing or parks. It should be, is this particular piece of land the right place to provide that housing? And there may already be other ways to increase housing supply. The Seoul government has argued that substantial housing can be generated through redevelopment and reconstruction. A Seoul housing briefing estimates that redevelopment projects could result in more than 311,000 homes starting construction by 2031. Again, that doesn't automatically prove that Yongsan should never be developed, but it raises a legitimate question here. Why use one of the most irreplaceable public spaces in Seoul if substantial housing can also be generated through redevelopment and other strategies? Before using an irreplaceable public asset, shouldn't we seriously examine alternatives? And this is why people talk about Yongsan as Seoul's potential Central Park. I'm not saying Yongsan is literally Seoul's Central Park. It isn't. But think about what Central Park represents. New York is one of the world's densest and expensive cities. Yet generations ago, New Yorkers decided that a huge piece of land in the middle of the city should remain public space. They understood something that is easy to forget. A city needs places that are not built on. Places where people can walk, where children can play, where people can experience nature, where communities can gather, and places that can remain valuable for generations. Seoul now has a similarly rare opportunity to make a long-term decision about what kind of city Seoul wants to be. And I don't think this should be reduced to left versus right. There is certainly a political dimension, but Yongsan Park has a much longer history than today's political controversy. The project was strongly associated with the Nomu현 administration, and the Special Act was enacted in 2007. So this isn't simply a case of one political camp wanting a park and another political camp wanting apartments. The bigger question is, what should a modern megacity do with a piece of public land that it spent decades recovering? This isn't about party politics. It's about urban planning and public policy. And this isn't people versus trees. Someone might say people need homes. Isn't that more important than a park? Of course, housing matters, but parks are also for people. People need housing, but they also need clean air. They need nature. They need places to exercise. They need places for children to play. And they need public spaces where they can gather without having to spend money. A successful city isn't just a collection of buildings. It's also the spaces between those buildings. And the more densely populated a city becomes, the more valuable those public spaces can become. So again, the question isn't, are people more important than trees? It's, do we actually have to sacrifice this particular piece of land to provide housing? There's also an environmental issue. The former military base has a history of soil contamination. Remediation has been one of the major challenges associated with returning the land, and that creates a legitimate counter-argument. Someone could ask, if the land is contaminated and expensive to remediate, why use it for housing now? It means the land requires careful, long-term planning. A national park can incorporate ecological restoration and historic preservation. Residential development requires permanent buildings, roads, utilities, schools, and other infrastructure. So this isn't simply unused land. It's a complicated, historic environmental landscape that requires a very deliberate decision about its future. And then there is the question of time. Housing policy often operates on a relatively short time frame, 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years, but a national park can exist for hundreds of years. Think about Seoul in 2200. The people making this decision today will be long gone, but the consequences of this decision could still be there. If Seoul preserves Yongsan, future generations inherit a huge public landscape in the center of the city. If Seoul develops it with permanent housing, then opportunity is effectively gone. That's why this isn't just about today's housing market. It's about what today's generation leaves behind. So what should happen? I believe the minimum requirement should be a transparent and independent assessment. We should ask, what's the historical significance of this entire site? And what's the cultural landscape value? Also, what's the ecological value? And what's the long-term urban planning value? And what exactly would Seoul lose by developing this land? The public should be able to see the evidence behind this decision, and international experts should be able to look at this issue as well. Organizations can consider cultural heritage and cultural landscapes. And this is why I'm making this video, because Yongsan isn't only a Korean issue. Every major city faces some version of this dilemma: housing versus green space, development versus preservation, and short-term needs versus long-term planning. And once a city is fully developed, large public spaces become incredibly difficult to create. Yongsan is unusual because Seoul still has this opportunity, a huge former military base in the center of the Seoul with more than a century of history and the possibility of transforming it into a major public park. That opportunity is incredibly rare. So here's my position. What I'm asking is whether we should sacrifice an irreplaceable public asset to solve a problem that may have other solutions. And before making a decision that could last for centuries, shouldn't we have an independent, transparent, and evidence-based discussion? Is this really the best place for thousands of apartments? You can build another apartment complex, but you can't build another Yongsan Park. And once we build on it, we can never get this opportunity back. So if you believe this deserves a wider conversation, please like and share this video. Thank you for watching.